Off the northern coast of Oregon, the Pacific Ocean moves without interruption. Swells arrive from thousands of miles away, compressed by prevailing winds and released against the shoreline with regular force. Near Tillamook Head, the coastline bends and narrows, and the water deepens quickly. Kelp beds thin out. The sea floor drops. What remains above the surface is rock. Tillamook Rock rises abruptly from the water, just over a mile offshore. It is not an island in the ordinary sense. There is no beach. No gradual slope. The rock lifts straight from the ocean, steep-sided and narrow, its surface broken by fractures and ledges. In rough weather, waves strike it from all directions. In heavy seas, spray clears the top. The climate here is maritime and unstable. Fog forms without warning and can last for days. Winter storms bring sustained winds and long-period swells. Even in summer, conditions change quickly. The boundary between calm and danger is not visible from shore. From land, the rock appears isolated but manageable. From the water, it is something else. Approaching it requires timing, clear conditions, and luck. Boats cannot linger. There is no sheltered side. For centuries, the rock existed without human use. It had no name beyond what local sailors gave it in passing. Birds nested on its ledges. The ocean shaped it incrementally, eroding and breaking it down grain by grain. Only later would the rock be altered. Only later would it become known as Tillamook Rock Lighthouse, a structure imposed on a place that resisted presence from the start. The sea did not change when people arrived. It continued on its schedule. By the mid-19th century, maritime traffic along the Pacific Northwest coast had increased steadily. Timber, grain, and manufactured goods moved between California, Oregon, and Washington by ship. The coastline, however, offered few natural harbors and little in the way of navigational aid. Vessels approaching the Columbia River or traveling north toward Puget Sound relied largely on dead reckoning and intermittent coastal landmarks. The area near Tillamook Head was particularly hazardous. The headland extended into the Pacific, altering currents and wave patterns. Ships rounding it were frequently pushed closer to shore than intended. In poor visibility, the risk increased sharply. Over time, the waters near the headland became associated with repeated groundings and wrecks. Among the most significant incidents was the loss of the British ship Lupatia in 1881. Carrying cargo and passengers, the vessel struck rocks near the headland during heavy weather. Although some aboard survived, the wreck drew attention to the absence of a fixed navigational warning in the area. Other losses followed. Newspaper reports and maritime logs documented the pattern with growing regularity. The U.S. Lighthouse Board, responsible for navigational safety along the coast, took note. By the 1880s, lighthouses had been established at major coastal points, but gaps remained. A light at Tillamook Head itself was considered, but the geography presented challenges. Fog often obscured the headland. A higher, more isolated light would be visible farther out to sea. Tillamook Rock offered that visibility. Rising directly from deep water, it stood apart from the coastal fog that clung to the land. From a purely optical standpoint, it was an ideal location. From a practical standpoint, it was hostile. Engineers and planners understood the difficulty. The rock had no safe landing area. Construction materials would have to be transferred in calm seas, a rare condition in that region. Workers would be exposed to weather with little shelter. Once built, the station would be entirely dependent on resupply by boat. Despite these concerns, the Lighthouse Board approved the project. The loss of ships carried economic and political weight. Technological confidence was high. Advances in masonry, optics, and steam-powered vessels suggested that the obstacles could be overcome. The decision reflected the priorities of the era. Maritime commerce was expanding faster than the infrastructure meant to support it. Risk was accepted as a necessary cost. The ocean was treated as something that could be managed through engineering and discipline. Construction was authorized in 1880. The rock, until then a marker of danger, was assigned a new purpose. It would become a fixed point in a moving sea, intended to impose order on a stretch of coast that had resisted it for decades. The sea remained unchanged. Reaching Tillamook Rock was the first barrier. Before any construction could begin, men and materials had to be transferred from open water onto a vertical surface that offered no harbor. Early attempts were limited by weather. Swells struck the rock unpredictably, rebounding in conflicting directions. Small boats could approach only during brief intervals of calm. The first successful landings occurred in the early 1880s. Crews waited offshore for conditions to align. When the water briefly settled, boats were driven close to the rock and held in position by timing rather than anchors. Men climbed rope ladders while the hulls rose and fell beneath them. Supplies were hauled up by hand. Any delay increased the risk of capsizing or being driven into the stone. Once on the rock, there was no margin for error. Space was limited. Tools, food, and materials had to be secured immediately. Waves frequently washed across the lower ledges, forcing workers to retreat higher. Work schedules were dictated entirely by the sea. Construction proceeded in stages. Temporary shelters were erected first, followed by platforms cut directly into the stone. Blasting was used to level sections of the rock, a process complicated by wind and spray. Each explosion had to be carefully controlled. Loose debris was a hazard, with nowhere to fall except into the water below. As the structure rose, the nature of isolation became clear. Crews could be stranded for days or weeks when seas prevented access. Supply boats often turned back without landing. Once left on the rock, workers could not leave on schedule. They stayed until conditions allowed retrieval. This was the point at which the project changed character. The difficulty was no longer theoretical or temporary. Access depended entirely on the ocean's tolerance. The rock set the terms. By the time the lighthouse structure neared completion, the pattern was established. Anyone assigned to the rock would arrive without certainty of departure. The sea, not the schedule, determined when contact with the mainland would resume. The lighthouse was not yet operational, but its defining condition had already taken shape. It would function only as long as people were willing to remain where removal was never guaranteed. When the lighthouse became operational in 1881, life on Tillamook Rock settled into a rigid system. The structure rose directly from the stone, a multi-level brick tower anchored into the blasted surface. Inside, space was functional and limited. Every room had a purpose. Nothing was ornamental. A typical assignment involved a principal keeper and several assistants. Their days followed a fixed routine. The light had to be maintained continuously from sunset to sunrise. During daylight hours, lenses were cleaned, mechanisms inspected, and logs updated. The work was repetitive and exacting. Errors carried consequences for ships that would never be seen from the rock. Fresh water was one of the first constraints. Rain was collected in cisterns and carefully rationed. During dry periods, water shipments were critical. If boats could not land, usage was reduced immediately. Washing was limited. Clothing was reused. Hygiene followed necessity rather than comfort. Food arrived by supply boat, usually every few weeks when weather allowed. Staples included flour, beans, salted meat, and canned goods. Fresh items were rare and quickly consumed. Storage was organized to account for long delays. When deliveries failed, meals were reduced. Keepers recorded inventory with precision, adjusting portions to extend reserves. Fuel was equally important. Oil for the lamp and coal for heating had to be conserved. The tower was exposed on all sides, and wind penetrated even the thick masonry. In winter, temperatures inside remained cold. Fires were controlled carefully to avoid waste or damage. Storms defined the environment. Waves regularly struck the lower levels of the structure, sending spray upward. During severe weather, water reached the lantern deck. The sound was constant. Wind pressure shook doors and windows. Visibility dropped to nothing. Movement outside was often impossible for days. Access to the mainland was unpredictable. Boats could not approach during heavy seas, and even moderate swells could make landing unsafe. When supply vessels failed to land, keepers accepted the delay without expectation of relief. There was no alternative. Medical care was limited to basic supplies. Injuries were treated on site. Illness was managed through rest and observation. In serious cases, evacuation depended on conditions that were rarely favorable. Decisions were made with restraint. Records note extended periods of isolation during which no contact with shore was possible. Mental discipline became part of survival. The routine provided structure. Logs were kept daily, recording weather, maintenance, and supplies. The act of writing was practical but stabilizing. It imposed order on a setting that resisted it. Communication with the outside world was minimal. Signals were limited. News arrived only when boats did. Time passed without markers beyond the duties of the light. Over months and years, the lighthouse earned its reputation. Waves damaged equipment. Storms delayed relief. Several keepers were injured, and at least one death occurred due to illness exacerbated by isolation. The rock did not accommodate weakness. Yet the light continued to function. Ships altered course in response to its beam. Wrecks in the immediate area declined. The system worked, but only through constant attention and acceptance of risk. The lighthouse demanded endurance rather than heroism. It required people to remain in place while the ocean dictated every other condition. The operating system of the lighthouse assumed that supply lines, though unreliable, would eventually resume. What it could not control was the duration of interruption. When storms persisted beyond expectation, the margin for error narrowed quickly. Winter brought the greatest strain. Storms arrived in succession, reducing visibility and preventing boats from approaching for weeks at a time. Swells increased in height and frequency. Waves struck the base of the lighthouse with enough force to send water through lower openings. Equipment degraded faster than it could be repaired. During these periods, isolation became absolute. Keepers reported complete loss of contact with the mainland. Supplies were rationed beyond standard procedure. Fuel usage was cut to the minimum required to keep the light operational. Interior temperatures dropped. Dampness spread through living quarters, affecting bedding and stored food. Health problems intensified under these conditions. Respiratory illness was common. Injuries that would have been manageable on shore became prolonged concerns. In 1897, an assistant keeper died on the rock after a period of illness. The inability to evacuate in time was a contributing factor. His death was recorded without elaboration in official reports. Psychological strain increased alongside physical risk. The constant noise of the sea eliminated silence. Sleep was irregular during storms, interrupted by structural inspections and concerns about damage. The boundary between day and night blurred during extended fog and darkness. Attempts to relieve keepers on schedule often failed. Replacement crews waited on shore while seas made landing impossible. Those already on the rock remained in place beyond their assignments. Fatigue accumulated. Routine, once stabilizing, became burdensome. The lighthouse itself showed signs of stress. Masonry required frequent repair. Metal fittings corroded rapidly in salt air. Windows shattered under wave impact. Each repair consumed limited resources and energy. Failure of any major component threatened the primary function of the station. Despite these pressures, the light was rarely extinguished. Records emphasize continuity over comfort. The expectation was not safety, but persistence. Over time, the accumulation of incidents altered official perception. The rock was no longer viewed solely as a difficult post. It was increasingly recognized as a liability. The system worked, but only at a cost that technology was beginning to offer alternatives to. The breakdown was gradual. There was no single event that ended manned operation. Instead, the evidence mounted: prolonged isolation, injury, death, and structural risk. The question shifted from whether the lighthouse could continue to function to whether it should require people to remain there at all. By the early 20th century, changes in maritime technology began to reshape lighthouse operations. Improvements in optics, power systems, and remote signaling reduced the need for constant human presence. For stations like Tillamook Rock, these developments addressed risks that had never been fully mitigated. The U.S. Lighthouse Service evaluated the cost of continued staffing against the hazards documented over decades. Maintenance remained difficult. Access was still governed by weather. Injuries and prolonged isolation could not be eliminated through policy alone. Automation offered a way to preserve the function of the light without requiring people to remain on the rock. In 1957, the decision was made to remove the resident keepers. The lighthouse was converted to automated operation, monitored remotely. The final crew departed when conditions allowed, taking only essential personal effects. There was no ceremony. Departure was treated as a procedural task. After automation, the structure continued to operate for a time, but its role diminished as navigational systems advanced. Eventually, the light was extinguished. Responsibility for the site ended. The rock returned to isolation, now carrying the remains of a structure designed for a different era. No permanent human presence followed. Tillamook Rock remains where it has always been, unchanged in position and character. The lighthouse built upon it was an intervention shaped by necessity and confidence, reflecting a period when human systems were extended into places that resisted them. The record of its operation is not one of conquest, but of accommodation. Those who lived and worked there did so within narrow limits. Their survival depended on routine, restraint, and acceptance of uncertainty. The environment did not adapt in return. The story of Terrible Tilly is preserved in logs, reports, and structural remnants. It stands as a measure of what was required to maintain a single point of light in an uncontrolled sea, and of the cost paid to do so.